So in the last video, we talked about some of the pros and cons of nuclear energy. Pro, there's plenty of nuclear material to keep generating nuclear energy long into the future. Pro, it generates very little in the way of greenhouse gases or other atmospheric pollutants. It doesn't pollute waterways, it doesn't pollute airways, it doesn't have those kinds of environmental effects. Con, each nuclear power plant is kind of expensive to set up, and for the amount of energy you need to extract to refine the uranium, set up the nuclear power plant, the amount of energy you actually get back out is moderate compared to other types of fuel sources that you might use. So, not great net energy yield, but new technology might fix that. And big con, is that it generates nuclear waste, which we don't have a good storage solution for, and that can remain dangerous for tens of thousands of years. However, that is not really the reason why a lot of people have concerns over nuclear energy. It's not the storage solution of the nuclear waste or even concerns about the nuclear waste at all, although some people will talk about that. In general, the major public concern about nuclear energy is the risk of nuclear meltdowns and the association with nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. So, although nuclear power is clean, lacking the pollutants of fossil fuels, it has faltered due to 1. Cost overruns, very pricey development of this technology, and public fears of catastrophic accidents like those of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima Daiichi. Now, of these, Chernobyl is really the worst one. That's where there was a strong release of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Fukushima Daiichi also, there was some exposure of the radioactive material outside of the plants themselves. 3 Mile Island was actually contained. These are just sort of the big events that people think about when they think about nuclear energy, and this is one of the reasons why it's difficult to build new nuclear power plants. So of the 430 nuclear power plants, about 100 have closed, and we're pretty slow to build new ones. Now, this said, these 3 events, and we're going to go through some of them, like the details of what happened, this is in the entire history of nuclear energy. Whereas we looked at oil and how many oil spills there were, and there's like 3 or 4 of them per year, major spills where materials actually get into the environment and damage ecosystems and all of that. So if you're to look at the safety of nuclear energy versus oil, or coal, which is regularly pumping out pollutants into the atmosphere, or fracking, where fracking chemicals and methane and oils getting into drinking water in some cases, things like that. Nuclear energy is much safer than those other forms of energy. It has a better track record. So 3 Mile Island, this one took place in 1979, the first kind of big one. This is near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A water pump failure allowed pressure to build up inside the reaction core. So remember, you have those 3 loops in a nuclear power plant. The loop with the water in the reaction core needs to be cycling round and round and round to make sure that the water is in constant motion. Otherwise, the water directly around the reaction core is just going to build up in temperature. It's going to build and build and build. It needs to be moving and continuously getting cooled to make sure that we're venting off that heat somewhere. If the water's not moving, you're going to get more and more heat beginning to build up. So when this happens, a relief valve automatically opened. However, it failed to close once more. And cooling water managed to escape the reactor. This then caused the nuclear fuel rods inside to begin to undergo what we call meltdowns. There's so much heat that the uranium itself begins melting, essentially. Now, the radiation released was actually pretty minimum, and it was never enough to cause any detectable health effect in the general population. 3 Mile Island was a very scary event, but it didn't ever have any noticeable effect. There was no major release of radiation that caused any kinds of problems. Like I said, it was basically contained. And from that, we learned about essentially some flaws in our design, and we adapted those into all future designs, and we learned that there are ways to do it a little bit better. Now, Chernobyl, on the other hand, there was a dramatic release of radiation from the core, and the reason why there was a failure at Chernobyl is due to several different factors: lack of communication, flaws in the reactor design, all kinds of things going on here. So essentially, what happened? And this is north of Kiev in the Ukraine. You may have seen Chernobyl pop up in the news again recently. Operators were performing a test to see how the reactor would fare in case of an electrical failure, right? So the pump needs to keep the water cycling. So what happens if we cut the electricity? How would the reactor work in that situation? As I recall the story, they didn't actually communicate that they were conducting that test to some of the other teams. They were trying to get authentic results. But so maybe a little bit more communication would have been helpful. But this revealed a design flaw in the reactor, which caused a power surge. They stopped pumping water around. Again, heat started to build up, and this created more and more and more heat, which then actually increased the amount of steam being generated and surged the amount of power. The core hadn't been shut down prior to the test, which would have been a good safety precaution. And the power surge triggered events that sent the nuclear reaction out of control, causing 2 explosions. And you can see here the aftermath of that explosion. You can see the building destroyed right there. The subsequent fire plume that got sent up released some radioactive material into the atmosphere, which was then spread by the wind. About 5% of the core material was released. 2 plant workers died on the night of the accident. 28 more people died within a few weeks from the radiation poisoning. Several thousand more were put at risk of cancer, but as of 2005, only about 15 were fatal. Now, obviously, having a nuclear reactor which underwent this kind of accident was a really big embarrassment for the Soviet Union. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at the time. They didn't want to talk about it. The Iron Curtain is well in place at this point. But the rest of the world could tell that it had happened because we could detect the radiation on the winds being carried through, and we could use our weather models to figure out where that radiation had come from. So we said, hey, Russia, did Chernobyl just explode? And they denied for a while, but yeah, it was pretty clear what had just happened. Now, these plant workers that died here and the cases of cancer that were fatal that have been quoted, these are essentially all of the deaths that have ever occurred as a result of nuclear power plants. Compare that to, say, coal, which is responsible for 6 times the number of accidental deaths, 500 times the number of deaths per pollution, and 11,250 times the cases of serious illness per terawatt hour. So while the phrase nuclear meltdown sounds scary, and these are big flashy events that are very newsworthy, the realities of coal mining and coal burning and the pollutants that are created by burning fossil fuels and all these, they are much more deadly to the human population that surrounds those areas and to the people who work in those industry than nuclear energy ever has been. Of all of the power types, of all the non-renewable power types, nuclear is the safest. For a more direct comparison, 2 workers died on the night of the accident at Chernobyl. 11 died on the day of the Deepwater Horizon oil explosion. So my point there is simply that, yes, the risk of safety in nuclear power plants is something to consider, but we shouldn't forget that there are huge risks associated with the other forms of energy production that we have, particularly fossil fuels. Now, last but not least, the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. This was really a worst case scenario. There was an earthquake followed by a tsunami that hit Japan, so that knocked out the electricity. So again, the pumps lost power, and the workers could not maintain the water levels in the 3 reactors, which meant there was insufficient cooling, leading to nuclear meltdowns and the release of radioactive material. So you might notice a pattern here. All three of these accidents have to do with an inability to keep the core sufficiently cooled, to keep the water flowing in the core, because it's under high pressure. And when you have a high pressure system and you can't maintain the temperature, you're going to have some problems there. So the interesting thing that occurred here is that it really changed Japan's position on its energy policy. In a few years, Japan went from having 43 nuclear power plants to 1 nuclear power plant. They ended up decommissioning pretty much all of their nuclear power plants. Now, in terms of people that died as a result of this accident, there were some workers that were injured in the explosion itself. There were lots of people that were injured due to the earthquakes and the tsunami. And there were additional injuries associated with the evacuation and all that. And there was some people that were exposed to some radiation, but there have been no cases of acute radiation sickness or any deaths attributed to the radiation exposure itself. So there, again, pretty much the Chernobyl deaths amount to just about every death that has ever occurred due to nuclear power in history. So again, the thing that everyone is worried about with nuclear power plants, which is the risk of nuclear meltdowns, is not really something that they need to worry about so much, because nuclear is the safest form of non-renewable energy that we have. Compared to all the other forms of non-renewable energy, this has very few deaths associated, or very few sicknesses associated with it. These are basically the only three disasters that we can talk about, and their effects are pretty limited. Chernobyl being the one where a large portion of radiation actually did manage to escape. And the big problem with nuclear that you don't hear talked about as much is the storage of the nuclear waste, which we still don't have a really good solution for. But let's say that you're still concerned about those nuclear disasters, those potential nuclear meltdowns. What are we going to do about it? Well, let me introduce you to the Price-Anderson Act, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Nuclear, which is a reference to an old movie, don't worry about it. This makes funds available through private insurance to compensate the public in the event of any nuclear accident. Effectively, every nuclear power plant in the United States has to pay into this kind of shared pool of insurance money, so that if there's a nuclear accident at any one plant, all of them have been paying into this large insurance pool so that the claims can pay out to all of the people that live around that plant in a fairly large amount. They are insured for about $13.6 billion. And then if that is insufficient, the government will provide additional money, additional funds to meet the excess. So that is what the Price-Anderson Act requires and provides for. So during the 3 Mile Island disaster, about $71 million was dispersed for claims and litigation costs related to that accident. And that was in a situation where none of the radiation was ever exposed, or no detectable levels of radiation were ever exposed to the people around it, but claims were still made and paid out as a result of the Price-Anderson Act. Now, I've mentioned the potential for future technologies a couple times when we were talking about nuclear, and in general I mean improvements to the design of conventional nuclear power plants that are powered by uranium. But there is a growing number of people who are advocates for, and I might even just say fans of, a different chemical element, which is called thorium. They want to see thorium power plants built. And the reason why they like thorium is because it offers a number of advantages over uranium. For one, you actually can get more usable energy out of thorium reactors than you can out of uranium reactors. They still produce nuclear waste, but that nuclear waste is less radioactive, and it has a shorter half-life than the uranium nuclear waste, so it's actually safer. thorium can actually be put into a liquid form. So instead of having these fuel rods which are surrounded by water and the water is superheated and put under pressure, what you can do is have liquid thorium circulating around the primary loop. And it doesn't need to be under pressure because the thorium itself is what is heating up. It doesn't matter if it melts. In fact, it's liquid. It's already melted. So it's getting really, really hot there. And you're just allowing it to cycle through and pass through a moderator, which would be like a lattice work of like graphite, which we noted earlier also works as a really good moderator. And when it passes through that network of graphite, then it's doing its fission reaction, and then it passes through and continues and continues and continues. So you still get the same reaction, but the big important part is that it's not a container that's under pressure like all of those other things. You notice that all of those disasters we talked about occurred because there was an issue with the cooling, there was an issue with the pressure containment vessel. That was the main stumbling block for a lot of them. So this completely removes that. Additionally, if they have this very clever idea, which is you might have noticed that another one of the problems that showed up with those nuclear disasters was that whenever the power was cut, that it prevented them from being able to use the pumps. You need some electricity to work the pumps, and if the pumps weren't working, then heat continued to build up. However, thorium reactors have this different design, where there's a drain at the bottom of the reactor, and the drain leads to a containment vessel. So just a secure containment vessel. But there's a plug in the drain, which is made out of like a frozen block of, let's just say ice right now. It would probably be made out of a different material. But it's just a frozen block. If the core becomes overheated and we lose power, what happens is the hot material up above will melt the ice plug, and all the thorium, the liquid thorium that's responsible for the reaction, is going to drain into that vessel below. And since it's no longer in contact with the graphite moderator, it can't do the fission chain reaction. So in this way, because you need electricity to keep the plug frozen, it's like a refrigerator, when the power is cut, it just automatically shuts itself down. The core shuts itself down. So it's got this kind of built-in safety mechanism that improves on those previous designs. Another advantage of thorium, I can go to this link here, is if we go to this list of the abundance of various elements in the Earth's crust, and we take a look, Control F for uranium. Uranium is number 49 most abundant in the Earth's crust. Thorium is number 38. It is way more abundant in the Earth's crust. So there's just more thorium available than there is uranium. Another advantage of thorium is that thorium reactors do not produce plutonium as a byproduct, so you could allow the development of thorium reactors without having to worry about nuclear proliferation. So with all of these pros, you can see why there are a lot of fans of this technology, right? Why haven't we built a ton of thorium reactors? Well, for one thing, all of these are really good advantages on paper, but since we've never built a thorium reactor, we don't actually know how they would work in practice. We don't know what the practical applicability of these would be. And two, because of that kind of fear of nuclear technology, no one wants to take a risk on the funding for a full-scale thorium reactor. So getting permits to build one, or getting funding to build one, or getting even research for R&D to research the technology for it, right? That's an investment, and if you're not willing to fully fund the completed project, even if the technology looks good in the research stage, you're just not going to fund that research stage, right? So movement on thorium reactor development has been pretty stagnant, honestly. when we first developed nuclear technology, we kind of thought that it was going to be the new fuel source. Fossil fuels were going to be a thing of the past. This was going to be what all of the fuel of the future was going to be. And it turns out that the net energy you get out of uranium reactions, out of nuclear power plants, it's got such a low net energy yield that they are only possible as energy generating plants really because of government subsidies. So improved reactor designs will have better net energy yields. Like current designs that we have for uranium power plants will have better net energy yields. And we have new technology, or we have designs for other kinds of plants that may be even better than that, but we would need public sentiment on nuclear to change in order to develop them, or funding to increase in order to development, and there's just no movement on that right now. Generally, people prefer to promote renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, as opposed to investing in nuclear. They would rather see their tax money or their own dollars gone into those renewable energy sources than nuclear as an alternative to fossil fuels. So we're going to talk about some of the renewables next.